My uncle is almost 80 years old this year. He is a very famous doctor that everyone in the village knows, and this story is what he told me. It was a day in the late 1980s. It was so hot that my uncle couldn't sleep, so he opened the main door and window to let some air in. His house did not have a television or computer. Without electricity, most people would go to bed early every night. When my uncle looked at the clock, it was almost midnight. The heat had subsided a bit, so he put his book back and prepared to go to sleep. As he was about to go to bed, he heard a hurried knock on the door outside. He knew that someone might have been sick to suddenly come in the middle of the night to find him, so he would hurry to open the door. In front of him was a young man around his age, with a face concealed in the dim light. But he guessed that the two of them were from the same village. They were just not familiar with each other. Because of his working habits, he was not really in the mood to look at people, but this attention was always on the wound or what was wrong. He shined an oil lamp near the man's arm to examine that wound. He was surprised to find out that it was a fairly deep wound, triangular in shape, like being poked by an iron object. It looked like a part of the flesh was lost. Although there was no bleeding, my uncle also frowned because this wound was showing signs of necrosis and changed quite badly. Having said that, he led the young man into the house to examine the wound further. He was definitely afraid of the wound getting worse, so he only said that he would try his best to give him first aid. For the rest of the treatment, the man had to go to the hospital. When the man heard that he had to go to the county for treatment, his expression was a bit strange, as if he didn't want to go far. My uncle thought he was just like the other villagers here and did not pay much attention to this illness, so he shook his head and went inside to get his tools. He used alcohol to disinfect the wound, but the young man was a little evasive. My uncle assumed he was afraid of pain. He also comforted him for a while, then diligently cleaned his wound and began to stitch it up. He burned the sewing needles on the oil lamp, and to disinfect them, of course, as he proceeded to stitch the wound up. But what happened next made my uncle feel a little strange. As the needle pricked into the man's skin, he was afraid that the man would feel some pain, so he wanted to reassure him. However, he was worried. The man had absolutely no expression on his face, showing no pain, nothing, not even saying a word. My uncle then sighed, and in his mind he was thinking of how strong this man must be not to know any pain. Only then did he clearly see the young man's face under the oil lamp. The face was pale, like a dead person's. But he didn't mind it much, as he was focusing on stitching up the wound. He just thought that maybe it was because the man lost too much blood, so he was just like that at the moment. Sewing took about half an hour. It was temporarily considered finished. My uncle remembered that he sewed 8 stitches and waited for 2 more stitches on the outside to remove the thread. The man suddenly looked up at the sky outside, panicked, and even pulled out a needle with his own hand. He was looking extremely impatient. This stunned my uncle for a moment. He kept staring at the steel needle that had not yet been removed and the thread still on the young man's wound. Just as my uncle was about to say something, the man suddenly shouted, "It's too late! It's too late!" and then rushed out. My uncle was stunned. Then he reacted and chased after the man because he was worried about the wound. As they reached the yard, the man suddenly just disappeared, as if he had turned into thin air. My uncle stood there for a long time. He didn't understand what had just happened. He was obviously quite confused, even thinking that he might have just met a ghost. Then he went back inside, and as he was about to turn off the light to go to sleep, he heard a knock on the door again. The man who came this time was an acquaintance, a small carpenter from a neighboring village. It turned out they were struggling with a difficult birth, so he came here to ask my uncle to come over and aid them. My uncle didn't have time to rest that night. He took his medicine kit and went with the man. It was the village next door, not too far. The two of them walked for only more than 20 minutes. But when my uncle ran to the door of the little carpenter's house, he heard the cry of newborn baby. That was the prospect of a mother and a child. Both my uncle and the carpenter felt more secure. Entering the house, they found that the mother and the baby's son were safe and sound, especially very pretty cute baby boy that was lying next to her. Since my uncle had already arrived, he couldn't turn around and do anything. After that, he cut the umbilical cord, cleaned and disinfected the baby, and washed the mother's wounds. But just as he was preparing to disinfect the baby, he discovered something strange. On the child's hand there was a red birthmark. A red thread, connected in lines very similar to the place where the wound was sewn on the man before. And adjacent to that, a shape like a sewing needle on the arm of the baby. My uncle was suddenly stunned when he saw this. And then he understood what has happened to the child. He realized why the man was in such a hurry. Perhaps because he was afraid of missing his reincarnation on time. My uncle had heard many stories about it, but this was the first time he witnessed it. Since then, the birth of the child with him stayed like a picture in his mind, with a shadow underneath. Although they didn't live in the same village, he often came to visit my uncle. He also loved him very much. After my uncle was honored as a child's godfather, which created a magical destiny. In recent years, due to the zoning plan of our village, the small villages have been merged into one area and some scattered houses near the town had to be demolished. Everything here was getting better and better, and my village was also built with a nursing home where some old lonely people used to live. Furthermore, last year's New Year's Eve, the village gathered a number of volunteers who came to be with these elderly people and make them feel happier. On New Year's Eve, many people gathered around to make dumplings and cook dinner. The atmosphere here was much more bustling and fun than usual. Compared to the busy nursing home, my family ate earlier and we finished our dinner as soon as it got dark. After I finished eating, I went out with some of my friends to find someone to play cards with. When I passed through the gate of the nursing home, I saw people still cooking meat on the big stove. At this moment, an old cadre who was with everyone in the yard saw us standing outside the door and hurriedly called us over. Mr. Goro was a well-known former official and was respected in the village by everyone, including myself. As soon as he called, we all gathered together and he gave each of us a cigarette. I knew that Uncle Goro must have had some business to rely on, so I thought to myself that maybe I wouldn't be able to gamble that night. Sure enough, on New Year's Eve, the nursing home held a reunion party to welcome the new year for all the lonely elderly people. Mr. Goro asked us to come and pick up Mr. Hiroshi to celebrate the holiday because Hiroshi was also a bit lonely. We looked at each other a little hesitantly when he asked for help. We had no choice but to do it. After that, I drove the car towards the old village. Mr. Hiroshi was an old man who had never had a wife. When the village was replanned, although he was advised, he refused to leave because he did not want to destroy the memorial house where he lived for decades. My friends and I drove to the old village. This place was demolished and poorly planned, so it was almost deserted and very desolate. The whole wasteland was left with only Mr. Hiroshi's house, and it seemed that because the wiring was broken, there was no electricity, so only kerosene lamps were used. Because the path on the hillside was narrow, we parked the car at the bottom of the hill and walked a short distance before reaching his house. As soon as I entered the yard, I was about to scream when I suddenly heard a voice like a conversation between two people. Hearing this voice, we were curious as to whether Mr. Hiroshi was living alone there and who he was talking to. We looked at each other curiously and followed quietly. Meanwhile, the voices in the house continued. The house had an ancient style with window stickers. Standing on the steps outside the door and looking inside, I could vaguely see two figures sitting in the middle of the house. One of the two figures we saw was a woman. I wondered if Uncle Hiroshi had found a wife. If so, that would have been great news. We looked at each other and decided to find out. Perhaps we could quickly find a bit of breaking news in this boring holiday. I quietly wet my finger with some spit and gently punched a small hole through the window paper. I was looking into the house with one eye. My thoughts at the time were to see if it was a woman and if she was an acquaintance in the village that we knew. But when I looked in, I saw Mr. Hiroshi sitting at the table with some dishes and candles. He sat at the end of the table, took a sip of wine, picked up a piece of meat, and placed it in the opposite bowl. He kept commenting on the taste with the other person. But there was no one on the other side of the table. The wine glasses and rice bowls were still full. No one was eating. However, he talked very enthusiastically as he ate. It seemed like there was an actual person sitting there, but we didn't see anyone, even though I had seen two figures with my own eyes just a moment before. My scalp was a bit numb, so I involuntarily stepped back. Mr. Hiroshi was inside, hearing someone outside, and turned his head towards the window and shouted loudly. After being called like that, we looked at each other blankly and were confused as to how to respond. Fortunately, Mr. Hiroshi had known us ever since we were all children. He heard our voices and became softer. But the atmosphere was still awkward as the two sides faced each other. Mr. Hiroshi's face showed an unhappy expression when we overheard. The three of us immediately told him about the purpose of our visit. Out of curiosity, my eyes couldn't help but look inside the house. There was only 2 rooms, and at a glance I could see them all, but as expected, there was only Mr. Hiroshi. After that, he looked at the 3 of us at the same time and refused to go to the nursing home to attend the party because he said that his house was having a party too. Any other day before, we would have persisted into persuading him a few more times, but that day we really didn't dare to do so. After replying, we looked at each other and winked at each other, then turned to leave. I could feel like he was hiding something because he didn't go back into the house straight away. He waited until we were far away. I was really curious at the time, so I couldn't help but look back. I didn't know if it was an illusion, but I always felt like that place was a bit ghostly. And at that moment, I saw a pair of chopsticks placed on a bowl, suddenly rolling down on the table. The candle flickered slightly, and I wondered what wind could blow the chopsticks away, but not the small candle. My scalp suddenly shrank and my heart seemed to have frozen with it. I didn't know if it was Mr. Hiroshi's gaze that made the hair on the back of my neck shiver, or maybe it was, but his eyes made us feel a little scared. We quickly drove back to the new village and told Mr. Goro about what had happened at Mr. Hiroshi's house. I was expecting him to tell us something, but unexpectedly he just lit a cigarette and sighed heavily. He looked like he was about to say something, but in the end, he didn't say anything and just told us to go home. He gave us all some more cigarettes and then went back into the nursing home. We could clearly see that there was a mystery hidden here. Later, when we were playing cards, we heard that Mr. Hiroshi was not an unmarried bachelor, but was married when he was just 20 years old. Although they had no children, the couple's relationship was very good. He had only been happy for 10 years when his wife passed away of a serious illness. And since then, Mr. Hiroshi didn't go out much more, and his personality had also become quieter and less talkative. We didn't know what we saw that night, but maybe the reason why Mr. Hiroshi would rather live alone in that lonely place rather than leaving was that it had something to do with that matter.